Welcome to the New Testament edition of the Red Thread Redemption Podcast, where we are still weaving the red thread of Jesus Christ as the singular redemptive message of the Bible. I am your host, Stacy Watford, and I hope that you're having a great Thursday. One of the exciting things now that we're going to do is we're going to begin to look at the New Testament. And actually today, we're going to start the New Testament officially on Tuesday of next week. But today, we're going to look at the intertestamental period. And there are several reasons we're going to look at the intertestamental period, and I'll explain those in a moment. But I hope that you have been encouraged by the Old Testament so far and our study in the Old Testament. And I ask that you would just to continue to follow, to like, to hit the notification button, and follow us as much as you can. The main thing is, for our study, for our purposes, is to understand that time period of the intertestamental period. Now, one of the things that we're going to look at is, of course, ask the question, why in the world to study this period? Well, one of the reasons why we're studying this period is because Judaism obviously becomes shaped by the events that take place during this period. The Judaism that we confront, in other words, the Jewish way of life, the way of life in which Jesus was born into, that we confront in Matthew or even in any other New Testament book, really starts to develop toward the end of Malachi and during this time period of the intertestamental period there. However, the major source of industry, and this is going to explain to you in just a few moments how this changes over from the Old Testament time of Solomon to today, or to the time of Jesus. The major source of industry and the place where most of the money was deposited was the temple. It, in essence, became the bank for the Jews. It was where they came to bring their offerings, and of course, where they would use the money. I mean, one of the major funding resources for the temple was the feast. One of the largest money makers was, of course, the Passover. It was a huge event that brought in a lot of money, a lot of revenue into the temple, and so we get into now the major source of industry. So why, of all places, does this temple then become a bank? Well, Israel at this time, in the time of the intertestamental period, is in essence a powder keg waiting to go off. It was filled with civil war and strife. It was filled with certain kinds of just constantly animosity and things like that. But then also what we see as far as the canon and things like that of what's leading to the destruction of, or that will lead to the whole the leaving of the Greeks, the coming of the Romans, and things like that. Of course, intertestamental period being between the testaments of 400 years of silence. There's a gap in the biblical record where there's no scripture being written. It's a silencing of the prophetic voice. Judaism, again, places this at 400 BC, after the writing of Malachi. There were some Psalms. The Old Testament canon wasn't quite closed during the time of the Old Testament or the intertestamental period, but it will be closed by the time of Jesus' day. Now, before we jump to 350, and here's where I was going with the temple just a moment ago. Before we jump to 350 BC, let's go back a little further and examine, if you will, the time period of 515 BC. And the problem is that the Jews are so discouraged because of what has happened that they become slack in their dedication to God and rebuilding the temple. After all, in their minds, they're thinking to themselves, well, God is the one who allowed them to basically be defeated and the temple to be destroyed. We see this mentality in Ezra chapter 3, verses 11 through 13. It records the attitude of the people during this time. In fact, it says many of the ancient men that had seen the first house, in other words, they had seen Solomon's temple when the foundation was laid, they wept with a loud voice after the foundation for the new temple was laid. A few people shouted for joy, but the weeping was so loud that no one could hear the shouts of joy. And again, to give you the idea here is that the new temple is being laid under Joshua and Zerubbabel. You'll find these guys in Haggai, the book of Haggai. But yet, and also in Ezra as well. But there's a distaste. There's for those who saw Solomon's temple and all of its glory and the beauty that it had. So you have this, and again, here's just kind of a visual image of how the second temple morale and worship quickly deteriorated. There's no enthusiasm to rebuild. That's what you get from Ezra and Haggai. And when they bring sacrifices, they're bringing injured and blemished sacrifices unto the Lord. These are things that they never should have done, and even failure to bring the tithe and the first fruits of their labor in. All of this carries over into this is the temple mentality that you see in the New Testament. There is a further cultural deterioration that takes place between the northern Israel and southern Judah. Now, while the nation was divided, the capital of southern Judah, the southern kingdom of Judah, was Jerusalem. However, the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel became Samaria, and thus developed the people group that we see with an intermixing between the Assyrians called the Samaritans. They had in essence become the mixed breed between Jewish people and the Assyrians. And there's a story behind that you can, of course, go back to 1 Kings, chapters 10, 11, and 12, and understand that backlog and that story. And we will probably get to that at some point in time, perhaps in a little bit more detail, if we look at the Gospel of John, if we look at the uniqueness of the Gospels, that kind of thing. Some of the major sources of study that you can go back through and look for yourself would be things like the apocryphal books like 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Again, I wouldn't get up behind the pulpit and preach these things, but it's good for a historical account of what took place during the intertestamental period. So what happens now is the Greeks are beginning to roll through the Persian Empire and are taking them over. And so you have a guy from Macedonia by the name of Philip of Macedon. And basically he realizes the instability of the region and tries to, he tries to bring unity to the region, but he tries to bring unity under the banner of join us or die. His method of convincing the city-states to join his empire is by the sword. That really doesn't work out too well. People begin to rebel, and he fails to bring unity to a large empire, large region that he can't really get his hands on and control. Thus, his son comes along, and you may recognize his son. His son comes along, and his son is Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great begins to ask the question of how can I make a unified empire? Well, he realized that you could not do it by force. You cannot enforce unity from the outside. He found an internal union. He determined that the best way to have an internal union was to have a common culture. This common culture would have a set of values in which the community lives by, bringing a measure of unity. This culture that Alexander introduces to not only to Palestine, but to the rest of the remainder of the Persian Empire, now going to be the Greek Empire, would be Hellenism. It's the culture of Hellenism. So let's talk now just for a moment about Hellenism. One of the things about Hellenism, of course, is also not only with a common culture, is also having a common language. That the common language is Greek, and it was the language of Alexander's empire. When you learn the language, you learn the culture. And the Greek language becomes the language of commerce and schools and government, and that language spreads like wildfire. And in essence, when the entire language spreads and the culture spreads, Hellenism and the power of Hellenism spreads as well. And here's the real power of Hellenism. It was very appealing because the thing was, and again, here's where it kind of relates to our day in which we live in, is that you could retain your ancestral traditions. In other words, you could retain your Jewishness, you could retain being a Persian or being from Babylon or whatever. You could even retain your religion, simply just add Hellenism to it. Simply add Hellenism to it, and in other words, it was a very universal thing. It was a very universal thing, and it made Hellenism very attractive. The Greek philosophy was, there's no wrong answers to life's questions, only different answers. However, they were only tolerant, here's the trick, they were only tolerant when people did what they wanted them to do, and the agenda, because there's always, anytime you hear somebody talking about a tolerance, there's always an agenda. And in other words, I will be tolerant to a certain point, but my agenda is to push Hellenism, is to push the Greek culture. So, of course, with this pushing of the Greek culture, can you guess what religion, what people are against the idea of Hellenism, who are sitting right in the middle of Alexander's empire? Well, if you guessed the Jewish people, then you guessed correctly. Judaism's struggle with Hellenism. Judaism goes against all of the philosophies of Hellenism. Jewish people are asking the question, how do we relate to our world? You know, there's this war, and in essence, that's the war that's going on today, is how do we relate to our world? Hellenism was being crammed down the people's throats, and Hellenism was something that either you accepted or you suffered. The real issue of the intertestamental period is a battle for the heart and the mind. It was a culture war. Again, they're asking, how can we relate to our world? And believe it or not, Jewish people were divided on this issue. Some thought, and we'll get to the breakdown of that in just a moment, some thought Hellenism wasn't so bad, while others sought separation and to remain pure in their Judaism. The Hellenistic culture, the Greek language, is so much beginning to be embedded into the Jewish culture that the Old Testament Hebrew scriptures, the Torah and the Tanakh as a whole, the whole Old Testament, has to be translated into the Greek language. Because of Hellenism, you have two groups of Jews that are formed. You have, first of all, the Hasidim. And the Hasidim are the pious ones, the holy ones, if you will. They resist Hellenism. Their attempt is to remain faithful to Old Testament traditions. However, then you had the Hellenizers, or Hellenistic Jews. They're pro-Greek, pro-Hellenism, pro-culture, if you will. And their mentality is, the Judaism needs to be modernized. We need to do away with some of this old stuff. We need to bring in the new ways. It's okay. Hellenism was a way to do this. These two groups will hate one another, and that hatred runs even into the New Testament. The feud intensifies after 175 BC, when you have one of the worst rulers over the Seleucid Empire. His name was Antiochus Epiphanes IV, and he is so bad that it is believed that Daniel prophesied about him, and he is in essence the Antichrist to those who are living during this time. He is their Antichrist, if you will. And he is that bad. He's one of the worst rulers One of the things that he does, and I'll ask this question here, how were Jewish high priests selected? Well, they weren't really selected, were they? They were supposed to be descendants of the tribe of Levi. They were anointed with oil, and they received the sacred garments, and it was expressly forbade the recognition of other deities. In other words, they were supposed to remain faithful to Israel. Well, Antiochus bypasses Hebrew protocol and installs a Greek high priest by the name of Jason. Jason is a Hellenistic Jew who promoted Hellenism, and remember, Hellenism embraced everything. Jason built a gym next to the temple. In other words, if you're wondering where this idea of building a gym next to the church came from, it came from this idea of building a place of exercise next to, in fact, oftentimes Greek culture would do that, is that they would build a place of exercise next to their pagan temples, and now they've got one next to the temple of the Lord. They've got one next to the church. Well, what's the big deal? The big deal is that the Greek word that we get from gymnasium is the word gymnos, which means naked. In other words, this is how every Greek athlete participated in. Wouldn't you hate to be in that gym class? Is that they participated naked. So there are further splits into Jewish society. You have the Hasidim, again, the religious, the pure, the faithful. How can you be even more pure? Well, the Hasidim in themselves split into two groups. You have the Essenes, or you have the Pharisees. These are the groups that you see in the New Testament. From the Hasidim, you have the Pharisees. They are the religiously pure. They're faithful to the law. They stayed mainly in Jerusalem. Then you have the Hellenistic Jews. These were the aristocrats, politically minded. They become the Sadducees of the New Testament. Their major concern is politics and money. In fact, they're really not bothered by Jesus until that day that Jesus, and some people say that there's two places where he overturns the tables, tables of the money changers at the temple. And when he messes with their money, that's when the Sadducees actually join forces with the Pharisees and say, hey, we've got to kill Jesus. The fact that they hated one another, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the fact that they hated one another is an understatement. The civil war was so much so that they were about to enter into this bloody civil war of who was going to be in control. This hatred would continue until AD 70, when the temple in Jerusalem is finally destroyed for the last and final time. Well, guess who comes to the rescue? The Romans come to the rescue. The Romans are called in by the Pharisees and the Sadducees, by the Hasidim and the Hellenistic Jews, to try to delegate and bring some kind of peace. Now, so the negative things that come out of this, the positive and the negative contributions, was that the Romans accomplished further what the Greeks tried to do. They developed a sense of unity under the universal law. Free movement began out of the Mediterranean world. Because of the roads that they would establish under the Pax Romana, the time of peace. Sadly, the Roman conquest led to a loss of belief by many peoples in their God, because of the fact of not being able. I mean, this is what they were looking for in a Messiah. This is what the Jews were looking for. Is that the Jews were so eagerly looking for a Messiah who would come and overthrow the government. However, as we see in a prophecy in Isaiah, the people which sat in darkness, walked in darkness, have seen a great light. Those who dwell in the shadow of death, light has shined upon them. Jesus was the light that was born into this dark, bloody, divided time. Not to overthrow the Roman government, but to be the hope for all of the world. God bless you.